Hi, how's everybody today? Uh, I'm okay. If we talked at the front door, you might have noticed my brain is not really functioning this morning. And so I'm just praying, Holy Spirit, activate right now. Okay? Um, we had a shower yesterday for our lovely friend Trelise and a baby shower. And one of the things that I love about showers hosted by the women in this church is that no matter what comes out of that bag or that box, there is so much excitement. It's just like diapers, yes, diapers, pacifiers, whoa, pacifiers. There's just every time Trelise and Emerald would open something, everyone in the room cheered. Even though a lot of it was just normal, everyday stuff, it was so exciting. And my prayer this morning is as we unpack God's word, which is so much more than normal, everyday stuff, that our hearts would have that kind of excitement. That there's something really precious and beautiful and meaningful and useful within these words, within this story. And so that's been my prayer today. And you don't have to shout and, hurrah every time we do something, but I hope in your spirit you have that kind of expectation. Every time Trelise got a new bag, we all were like, what's gonna come out of that bag next? It didn't matter what it was. We were so excited about it. And so whatever God has for us today, I pray that your spirits would be eager for it. Because I think he can even use a foggy-headed middle-aged lady in the midst of, with his word. He can even use me. So will you just pray with me really quick as we give this time to the Lord? Oh, Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the ability to come together and to look at it. And you do this thing where we can be talking about something, but we can also be reflecting and examining our own hearts. And God, I just pray today that I pray you use me despite my foggy brain, despite my limited knowledge, Lord, that you use me in a way to help people understand your heart for why this story unfolded the way it did, what you want us to glean from it. Lord, I pray that your spirit would just be in this place, Lord, open minds and hearts to whatever it is you want to have us to hold today. We love you, God. We thank you for the gathering of the saints, that we can come together and look at your word and worship you in such a pure and beautiful way. In Jesus' name, amen. So every February, this actually started at our former church. We would have a relationship-focused month. And yet, it sometimes I think people hear relationship and they're like, oh, lightweight. Let's be honest, people, relationships are not easy. So this is not lightweight, even though we're talking about matters of the heart. We are created to live connected. We just are. Connected to God, connected to one another. And just even in the beginning of the Genesis account, all the way through the book of Revelation, it's clear in the Bible that relationships are important to God. He takes them very, very seriously. We look no further than the 10 Commandments. It's about relationship. And so we're going to take this month and we're just going to lean into this a little bit more. We know that we can be going about our life and we're like, we're good, we're trucking along, we're busy with the stuff of life, getting stuff done. Some of us are in just survival mode, let's be honest. We're just getting through and we think we're doing the best we can, so we're good. But then we hit a bump. And then we hit another bump. And sometimes those bumps really show us all the dirt that's been sitting at the surface. And so this is where I bring up my jar here. I worked many years with children, and I really feel like that was God's training ground for me to really understand the Bible. Because there were so many things that I had been raised in the church. My dad was a pastor. I went to Bible college. But working with children, there would be so many times where I'm sitting with them and I'm trying to teach them something. And I'm like, whoa, I just got that. And so this was actually something I did with the kids I worked with. And Connie, where's Connie? Where is she? Where'd she go? Oh, she's way back there. Connie actually was one of the kids that I worked with for many years, and now she's a college student. So you may remember this. So we're going along in life, and we're like, we're good, everything good, I'm good. People will run into you on the street. How are you doing? I'm doing great. But then we're going to use an example from my home. Someone leaves the refrigerator door open. Oh, that's a little foggy in there. Jesus said, out of the heart comes every thought. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his good heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. And so no matter how clear this water is, we run into bumps, shakes it up, and suddenly what was once the living waters, the spring of life that God has promised us, they're not so clear. And when we talk about the heart, I think for us, we have all the cute little heart icons, and we can do this with our fingers, and I love you. But when the Bible talks about the heart, it actually means so much more. Biblically, the term heart, which I meant to look this up, but I think instead of the heart being up here, they thought the heart was in the kidneys. Is that correct? But their idea of a heart was so much bigger than ours. It encompassed your feelings, your motivations, what you craved, what you desired, but it also included what you thought. Like your strategic thinking. It was the center of life, the totality of their inner selves. So as we talk about the heart, that's what we're talking about. And so we have this heart. God gave us living waters to put in our heart, and we're going along. And again, the refrigerator door is open. Ugh. Someone in our house really doesn't like that. And Esther lived with us for a while as well, and Annie. They know what the ding-dong on the refrigerator door being open can do to a person in the middle of their day. It's pretty serious. And it was me. Okay, so just a little foggy. Oh, Michelle left the refrigerator door open again, and she can't even hear the bell. But what happens at work when someone criticizes you? Ooh. Oh, actually, that deserves a big shake. Oh, yeah. Ooh, it's not so clear anymore, is it? That heart is like fogging up. Financial hardships. Ooh, yeah, boom, 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 boom. It just gets bigger and bigger, foggier and foggier. Oh, and abusive relationships. Somebody they just live with that dirt, that ugliness that just comes in and hurts a heart. There's so many things that mess up our heart. And we can shove all that stuff down. It could be laying on the bottom for years. But suddenly life gets bumpy, and suddenly there's no more clear water in there, and it's just ugly, dirty water. I don't know about you, but sometimes my heart looks like this. And so this month is all about taking time, examining our hearts, and letting not just the dirt settle on the ground, but let's get rid of that dirt so we can just have pure hearts. Okay, what do you think of the example? Was it good? Yeah, okay. Okay, so with the patterns of sin, that heart it's all around us. But it's not just a modern problem. I think we can look at modern days and think, oh, the world has never been so dirty. The world has never been so ugly. Since the fall, it's always been ugly. And even we look no further than a biblical hero, David, a man after God's own heart. And yet, one of the weeks we're going to talk about this, the moment that led him to cry out to God, create in me a clean heart, renew my spirit. This is a man after God's own heart who had seen so much victory. And yet, he allowed his heart to get into that space where there was just junk clogging it up. And so if David, a man after God's own heart, can cry out, "Create in me," so can we. And it's God who does the heavy lifting. And you might say, well, my heart's really good. Okay, let's just take a minute here. We're going to get real. Let me ask you a few questions. What happens when things go wrong? What happens when, say, someone hurts you? Oh, that's a big one for me. When someone hurts me, it's like kerplunk, kerplunk. All the ugly comes up. The Bible tells us to examine our ways, examine our heart. Writer and counselor, there's a wonderful book called, what is it called? Oh, Destructive Relationships. I think that's the name of it. It doesn't sound very hopeful, but it's actually a very hopeful book. She writes, knowing ourselves means we examine our hearts to discover what rules us and what we live for. When we see repetitive patterns that hurt others, we must do more than just name the behaviors. We're really good, we think of different personality tests or different things that are like, well, I'm this way because. And in our own way, we use that to validate our brokenness. But we must do more than just name our behaviors. Christ called us to be ruled by his love and live for his purposes. We cannot do this without a clear view of our own brokenness and need. Our heart patterns impact us, and they impact everyone around us. It's just the reality. So this is serious business. And over the next 4 weeks, we will be talking about heart patterns, examining heart patterns of 3 very different people that we find in 1 Samuel. We're going to be talking about a woman and 2 men. All 3 people, they're involved in this really beautiful overarching story, but they had different responses to hard things, even to good things. And what's the goal? What's the goal of the next 4 weeks? I like putting this stuff out there. That through this process, we would learn from them, their stories, and also examine our own hearts. Because of God's Spirit, we can do this. We can multitask. We can learn from them and also grow. Also, our approach will be both a character study and a study of the narrative. If you got a handout when you came in, wave them up in the air. We don't do notes very often. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Derek. Oh, yeah, Justin. We actually ran out of these pieces of paper, and so that's kind of exciting. But we're going to do, I'm a big note taker. It helps me retain just what we're learning. And so we're going to approach it from a character study and from a narrative study. And if you've been in English anytime lately, you'll know what a character study is. A character study is when you're looking at the inner working, the inner story, and the narrative is looking at the overarching story. And so every week, we are going to have these handouts available. And the goal is not just that you take notes, but again, we're going to do that little bit of multitasking. Like we're learning about these people, their inner workings, the story that they're a part of, but also it's a time for you to reflect and think about your own heart. And so these notes will be available. I encourage you to do it. Again, the more we involve our senses, the more we engage with the material, the more likely we are to retain it and then take it with us and do something with it. And so I just really encourage you to go along with this character study worksheet. I will say I'm not going to answer all these questions for you. And so if you're looking for like, oh, she said that, I'm going to fill it in. I have to be honest, I like that. I like going to things where they say exactly what I need to hear so I know exactly how to fill it in. That's not what's happening here. We are going to put our own thought, your own thought into it as you listen, but I want you to take it home with you. And I want you to do some research over the week. 1 Samuel, the first 2 chapters, that's what we're talking about. And you know what? The internet, Google is amazing. Make sure you're looking at good sources, though. So today we are learning about Hannah. Again, reading the larger narrative, but studying the inner part, what's going on in Hannah's heart. So if you have your Bible with you, the scripture will be up on the screen. But I'd love it when people open their Bibles or their apps. Again, involve as many senses as you can, and you're more likely to retain this. So turning to 1 Samuel, first I'm going to tell you some context. On your little sheet, it says, what does Hannah's name mean? In the biblical world, names meant a great deal, a really big deal. Hannah means grace or favor. And I know we have some Hannahs in here. So your name means grace or favor if you didn't know. And the story takes place at Shiloh, a city and sanctuary in ancient Israel. It's where we would now find the West Bank, Palestine. And it was a central location for worship. It was a very, very busy city. There was a lot going on. And also, it was a really dark time. You have to keep that in mind. It was a dark time for the nation of Israel because even their leaders, some of them weren't so great. So let's go to 1 Samuel. We're going to start in the first verse. There was a certain man from Mathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Okay, we got through that. I almost skipped that, but we'll say it. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. So pausing. In ancient times for a woman, a woman's worth was deeply tied to her ability to have children. And one thing that I think is so interesting is that if you look at the stories starting in Genesis of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and now Hannah, these are all matriarchs of our faith. And guess what? They all struggled with infertility. Isn't that interesting? That God could use something that's so out of their control to not actually to help them grapple with something that they couldn't make happen for themselves. But eventually these women, their stories, not only do we know them, we celebrate them. And it was all rooted in this thing that they couldn't control and that only God can answer. Moving on to verse 3 through 8. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah, so again, that's Hannah's husband, to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah. Again, this is the wife who had children, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival, again, this is Peninnah, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. And when I think that's such an interesting part of this verse, this went on year after year. But the thing is, they would do this 3 times a year. So 3 times a year, Hannah was put in this situation. And when this went on year after year, whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Okay, husbands in the room, just so you know, this will never help a situation. It just won't. I'm just letting you know. Yeah. Oh, Hannah, 3 times a year, year after year, they all head to Shiloh like one big happy family for this really beautiful sacred celebration. And there's nothing worse than being at a big party Oh, everyone's happy, everyone's feasting and celebrating, and the sadness in your heart is just worse and worse and worse. We had an event that we went to once, and I was in a really dark place. I was supposed to be helping at the event. I got there, I went into the restroom, and I was so sad about some things going on in her life, and I'm like, I can't be here. And I just left. I left. Yet Hannah is stuck there. And she's stuck there with a bully. Let's just call it what it is. Penina is a big old bully. And she has things in her life that I'm sure Jesus needs to meet, but she's a bully. And not only does she take this time, they live in community together, and they're at this celebration together. And I would think Penina would have her hands full with 10 children or however many she has at this point. But instead, she's using her energy and her time to provoke Hannah. Like, what's her deal? Ugh. Penina. Hannah had to feel very alone. So right now we take a moment, we think about, as we think of our character study, what's going on inside of Hannah? If you've ever been in a place where you felt unsafe, like everyone's happy and you're not, that's not a good place for you, probably, unless you're in a place where you can be honest about it. What's going on inside of Hannah? I think she had to feel very alone and helpless and a little bit fearful, because she has this woman who she's living in community with, in marriage with, and she's bullying her. And the whole not wanting to eat. I feel like the world is divided into two kinds of people. The kind of people who eat when they're going through hard times, and the kind of people who don't eat. I'm in the camp of I eat. Like, if something sad is happening, bring on the ice cream. But I can think of one time where I didn't want to eat because I was so sad. And that was when, years ago, 10 years ago, actually, our family, every year we would go to this cabin to celebrate Christmas with my parents. And we arrived on Christmas Day, and my mom it was a lovely meal of carbohydrates. And it was so delicious. She just loved carbohydrates. I love it too. So good. And she made this beautiful meal. She always worked really hard to make Christmas very special. And so we get to the cabin, it's snowy, it's so beautiful. And Jake said, I'm going to take Moose, our aging dog, on a hike. And just let me say, that day, Moose had gotten lost on another hike in Minneapolis because Moose was losing his sight. And so Jake comes back from his hike. Dinner is on the table. Again, my mom had worked so hard. And I'm like, where's Moose? Oh, he's coming. He'll come. He's coming. Let's just say Moose did not come. He was lost in like the northern woods. And we all sat down at this beautiful table filled with beautiful foods. It was Christmas Day. There were presents under the trees. And all any of us could think of was Moose being lost in the woods. And I remember poor Isaac and our daughter Sophie just sat there trying to be brave. And we started serving the food up. And Isaac and Sophie and I start crying. And all the food just sat on the table. And we all ended up, I think we went driving, calling for Moose, but nobody ate. We were so for yourself, when you are so impacted that eating is just, it's almost repulsive, you are in a sense of despair. The really good news is that Moose came back 24 hours later, and we ate all that food like in 5 minutes. And it was a wonderful, wonderful celebration. I still look back on that, and what was so sad became one of just the most beautiful Christmases. So Hannah is so sad she can't eat. I'm sure she was counting down the minutes. She just wanted to get home because the safety of home is a good place. She wasn't home. She couldn't run away. She couldn't hide. She was in the middle of this party. And then we have Elkanah saying, aren't I enough? If you have questions about that, why that's a bad thing for him to say, come talk to me. Just come talk to me. So let's continue in verse 9. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. Verse 9, she stood up. I love that. And this is where we see a shift in her story. Instead of just being passive, trying to get through, she actively engages with her story. I think sometimes the battle is just showing up. And kudos to all of you who are in tough places who still show up. But Hannah did more than just show up. She started engaging. And so, continuing, let's just repeat the end of verse 9. Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorposts of the Lord's house. So, Eli the priest, he was no normal dude. His name, just talking about names, means high or elevated. So we have Hannah, which means grace, favor. Eli, who's a high priest, his name means high or elevated. And at this time, there was no king for this nation, so he was the ruler. And this chair, it says he was sitting by his chair. This wasn't like one of these chairs. You know, this wasn't like one of our rickety chairs by our dining room table, if you've ever sat in one of them. This was a throne. This was a place where you went to do business. And so we have Hannah, who's standing up, who's starting to engage. And then we have Eli, this high priest, this man in charge, sitting in an important chair. But what made that chair so important was where the chair was located. And that was the doorposts of the Lord's house. And so you think you have Hannah, Eli, the Holy of Holies. And so she was going to the access point to meet God. And in her anguish, continuing in verse 10, in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget about your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of my life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. So weeping bitterly, this is like the snotty, uncontrollable kind of crying. She is doing that. She's pouring out her heart. It wasn't a pretty prayer. With tears and gut-wrenching honesty, she asks, God, do you see me? Do you see my pain? You haven't forgotten me, have you? And she's so desperate, she makes a promise. Lord, if you give me a son, you can have him. Verse 12, and as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli the priest, high and elevated between her and God, he looked at her mouth because she was probably she wasn't shouting this prayer. She was earnestly praying it in her heart. And her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Well, if you don't know the context, this might seem like a really odd thing to say. And remember, he was the access point between her and God. If I had received that kind of response to a heartfelt prayer, I would have just started crying harder and ran the other way. And this was a religious feast, but again, it was a dark and corrupt time. And so drunkenness had become normalized in this sacred space. And so I think one of the things that happens when we normalize destructive patterns is that it makes people critical and cynical. And I think in this moment, Eli was feeling critical and cynical. He saw all this drunkenness around him, people not behaving as they should in this safe, beautiful, holy space. And so he made an assumption. And we know that often assuming silences the other person. But sweet Hannah, she was determined. She had a lot of courage. And she said, verse 15, not so, my Lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking beer or wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. She is raw. And her vulnerability and honesty, although initially mistaken for drunkenness, comes from a place of such great grief. And I wonder, was Penina watching in the wings like, oh, she is making a fool of herself. This is going to be good. And she probably heard Eli say, hey. And you think if Hannah would just have ran away, the truth would have never been revealed. But she didn't. She stayed her ground, and she spoke from her heart. She goes right to the doorway of God and pours her heart out. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Hannah had been heard. And I love how her prayer is not quite answered yet, but that just act of being heard fills her heart, heals her heart. And she's well enough to eat of the feast, to enjoy the feast. Being heard is just something we need, especially when we're hurting. A principle in our premarital counseling that Jake and I do, and some of you have been through that or are going through this, when someone is hurting, it's your responsibility as the other partner to move towards that person with pain, to listen to that person with pain, because people cannot really hear until their pain has been heard. It's the truth of it. It's hard. It's hard to do. And sometimes maybe you're both hurting, but you really have to say who's hurting more. And then you move towards that person. For many, until they feel heard, they only feel pain. So in the course of time, verse 20, Hannah became pregnant. So I'm skipping a couple verses here, and there's so much other stuff we're not getting to. So please read these 2 chapters this week. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. Yesterday, I mentioned the shower we were at, and Sweet Emerald is having a baby brother, and we all think it's a hoot because she thinks her brother's name is going to be Wee Wee. And so names are important. Like, here's this unborn baby, and his little sister has already decided he shall be named Wee Wee. Names are a big deal. When I conceived Isaac with Jake, we as a family, that came out really weird, foggy brain. We as a family were going through a really hard time, probably one of the up to that point, one of the darkest times in our life. And we weren't planning on getting pregnant. We don't know how we got pregnant. And suddenly I'm pregnant. And so we thought, when you're pregnant, like naming a baby is such an exciting thing. And then we heard a message on the meaning of the name Isaac, and it meant laughter. And that was the first time in our family we had laughter for a long time. And so we knew long before Isaac came, we were going to name him Laughter. And so Samuel, she names her son Samuel, which means God heard. Isn't that beautiful? There's a lot more to Samuel's story, which Jake's gonna talk about a little bit next week. But we do know that Hannah kept her word. And she, at the age of 3 or 4, Samuel was taken back to Eli. Like, as a mom, that just how could she do that? She says, I prayed for this child when she returns, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. And I love, as a mom, again, she would have seen him 3 times a year because they made this trip 3 times a year. I can imagine dropping off a 3-4-year-old and saying, see you in like 4 months. Good luck. But she didn't do it with gloom and despair. Because if we read into the next chapter, there's actually this prayer of praise. And I'm just going to read a couple things from it. My heart rejoices in the Lord. This is Hannah's prayer. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock besides our God, like our God. What faith-filled obedience this woman has. What a woman, and such an example of an honest heart. I'm sure it wasn't easy. She hit her rock bottom. She had been misunderstood. But in that moment, she chose to be honest with God, even if it was a bit messy, even if it might be misunderstood. And she took her pain to God. The antidote to every hurting heart is an honest prayer. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I can be hurting about something, and I'll just, to God, I'll just spill it out. And I feel his peace. He already knows what's going on, but we miss out on the peace if we don't go to him with authenticity. Honesty is a healthy heart pattern. It just is. It's hard. And some of us, maybe it's harder than for other people, but honesty is the antidote. Life with God is both vertical and horizontal. And actually, worship team, if you want to come on back up, I'm going to close here with just a couple more things. Life with God is both vertical and horizontal. Horizontal meaning our relationship with one another. So this is life with God, how we relate to one another. Vertical is our relationship with God and how he relates to us. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. And so each week, one of the things we're also going to do is leave with you sticky statements. I think it's really easy to come into a space like this and forget. You go home, there's probably things to do, homework, chores, a nap to take, if you're me, and you forget things. And so each week, we're going to have a sticky statement, just something for you to take with you. And I encourage you to take a picture of it on the screen. And so our sticky statements for this week, the vertical, meaning the relationship between you and God. The antidote to a hurting heart is honest prayer. Just remember that. And so next time your heart is hurting and you are just wanting it to be calmed, maybe instead of going to something that's really not healing, just distracting, maybe instead in that moment, pray and give your ugly to God. I'm not a big cursor. I'm not. But I have cursed talking to God. And I've still felt hurt. He can handle it. In the horizontal, between us, between you and your friends, between you and your family. Don't assume, but do listen. It's so easy to assume. I do it all the time, and let me tell you, I am always wrong. Always. I don't think one time I've been right. And so with one another, be patient enough to listen. It's okay. It's okay to listen more. Your voice, it's just not that important sometimes. And especially if that person is hurting, you listen. Like David, we cry out, create in me. This whole series is called Create in Me. And today, our prayer is, Lord, create in me an honest heart. Hannah is a wonderful example of that. And I, too, need moments where I'm willing to be misunderstood and to be vulnerable. I may not even say it the perfect way. Truthfully, most of us won't. But if we agree to listen, to really listen to one another, we don't have to say it in a perfect way. And God's Spirit comes, and he's the one who wipes off the ugly, who cleans the dirt and replaces it with springs of living water. I love how he helps us. He helps us so much. And I believe his Spirit was helping Hannah that day, and he helps us today. I know some of these things are really heavy. Some of you may be in a great place and, enjoy that. But if you need someone to pray with you, Howard and Dawn Young are available. They're actually going to go back to this room starting this Sunday. We are going to have prayer available for you after service every week. This is something as a church we need to do more of. And so if you would like prayer, it's not like Hannah where you're going to be misunderstood. And because of Jesus, who is our high priest, we have access. We have access to God, like Hannah did it. But there's something about the saints coming around you and praying over you. And so if during this song or after service you would like prayer, these two, their hearts are to pray for you and to help you be honest about what's going on in your life. So we're going to stand for this last song. So if everybody would stand. And again, if you would like prayer, just go to that back room.